So welcome everyone to this side event of the UNESCO Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development. My name is Leanne Smith and I'm the Director of the Whitlam Institute within Western Sydney University, joining you today from Australia. And I would like to start this event by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from what was and always will be the Darug land of the Darug people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Thank you all for tuning in. Our panel members today in this virtual world are physically in Sumatra, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. And we welcome those of you in Bangkok for the forum, and for those of you further afield enjoying the forum virtually. This year's forum is of course focused on the impact of COVID, and I'd like to acknowledge the effect this has had for all of us in varying degrees, both personally and for our work. The forum is of course also focused on best practices and what we can learn from each other in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And this brings me to the subject of the Whitlam Institute's research and today's discussion, which is best practice SDG policy and planning, examples from Pacific Rim countries. But first, let me introduce you to our expert panel today. Dr Claire Brolan is from the Centre for Policy Futures at the University of Queensland, and she is our lead researcher on this project. Dr Brolan completed her PhD and postdoctoral studies on the formulation and implementation of the SDG 2030 agenda through a global health and rights lens. Claire is a leading Australian researcher and thinker on SDG policy and planning. She's a thematic expert for SDG 3 on the Legal and Economic Empowerment Global Network's high-level, multidisciplinary Human Rights and SDG Advisory Board to the United Nations. Ms Laiza Garcia is the Senior Program Manager at the Development Partner Institute for Mining in Melbourne. Laiza led the Mexican implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals based on an innovative tracking platform for UNDP in partnership with the Mexican presidency. She advocates for the UN SDGs as the Victorian Partnership Manager for the UN Association of Australia Young Professionals. She's a strong advocate of the SDGs and believes the pathway to meet the 2030 agenda is in igniting the power of multi-sectoral partnership to foster shared values. And last but certainly not least, Dr Amanda Katili Niode is the manager of the Climate Reality Project in Indonesia, part of a global organisation founded by Nobel Peace Laureate and former US Vice President Al Gore to mainstream the climate crisis, its solutions and actions. Amanda is an environmental management specialist, educator and writer. She holds a PhD from the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. She previously held a position as the head of the expert team at the Office of the Indonesian President's Special Envoy for Climate Change, and she was Special Assistant to the Indonesian Minister of Environment. She's been a member of the Indonesian delegation to the Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since COP13 in Bali. Thank you to all of you for joining this conversation. And I wanted to emphasise at the outset that none of our panellists today are representing the views of their respective governments. They're here as individuals. So, why this research? Australia, like 192 other countries, signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'll call them the SDGs from here on in, back in New York in 2015. As most of you will know, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its 17 SDGs are a universal agenda, the shared responsibility of all countries to achieve an economically, socially and environmentally sustainable future for us all, our children and our grandchildren. But in Australia, over 5 years later, we are still looking for national leadership for the implementation of the SDGs in this country. We find that the SDGs in Australia, if they are known about at all, are treated as a foreign and aid policy issue for how we manage our relations with other countries, not as a responsibility for the Australian government to implement at home for its voting population. Australia has no national SDG action plan, no planning or accountability mechanisms. and crucially, no linked financing for SDG implementation. Despite a 2018 parliamentary inquiry into Australia's implementation of the SDGs, none of its findings have been taken up. One of the inquiry's recommendations was that Australia look to international best practice in SDG implementation. So, as an offering to policymakers here, but also around the world, the Whitlam Institute commissioned Dr Brolan to lead this research project to identify countries who are demonstrating best practice and to see what tools and mechanisms we could look to in order to better deliver against our own international commitment. One fantastic feature of this research, an SDG Momentum Matrix, which you can find at the back of our report, draws all these best practices together in a simple tool for any policymaker or advocate to draw on. So for the next 10 minutes, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Brolan to give you a sense of our research methodology and the findings, particularly in relation to best practice SDG implementation in Indonesia and Mexico. Then I'll moderate a discussion around some key questions with our panel for about half an hour. And finally, we'll open up the discussion to your questions and comments, which you can submit at any time through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. So thank you for me again for joining us, and I'll hand over to Claire now. Claire, you're on mute, just so you know.
Sorry about that. How am I looking now, Leanne? Am I good to go?
Ready to go, fantastic.
Okay, great. Thanks, Leanne. It was such a pleasure to lead the research and to work with the Whitlam Institute. And I really commend the Whitlam Institute and you, Leanne, for identifying the need for this research project and backing it. And I'd also like to sincerely thank Dr. Ryan Wong for his research assistance and staff at the University of Queensland's Indonesian office in Jakarta for all of their support. There are a lot of country and global reports that speak to what is not happening or the gaps in SDG country planning and implementation and to SDG country deficits. But through this research, we really wanted to demonstrate to the Australian government and to the world how SDG planning and implementation can and is indeed occurring, that countries are taking SDG implementation seriously. So what I really like about our research is it first identifies best practice countries that are rolling up their sleeves and getting on with the hard business. It's a hard business of SDG implementation at a policy planning and governance level. And second, our report showcases the positive ways countries are and can implement the SDGs, and we do this by synthesising the research findings into an SDG Momentum Matrix, which Leanne mentioned, and a bit more on that shortly. As you can see on your screen, our research had 4 parts. To identify which 3 countries we wanted to do a deep dive into in terms of best practice SDG policy and planning, we turned to the 164 written submissions to the Australian Parliamentary Inquiry into the SDGs held in 2018. Now, the 164 submissions to that inquiry were lodged by Australian business and industry organisations, civil society, peak bodies, government and academia, and responded to 8 questions. And for the purposes of our project, we analysed responses to the inquiry's 8th question that sought examples of best practice in how other countries are implementing the SDGs from which Australia could learn. 3 best practice countries that inquiry stakeholders repeatedly highlighted, Germany, Mexico and Indonesia, were subsequently identified and selected to become the focus of our 3rd research component. We then conducted a series of key informant interviews with high-level SDG related policymakers and multi-stakeholders from the 3 countries. What we really wanted to know from these key informants was, what did they think were the key ingredients, the levers, the enablers for SDG policy and planning momentum and government appetite to implement the 2030 agenda in their respective nations. In conducting the case study research, we acknowledge that every country's political and governance structure, development and socio-economic contexts are unique and different. But no less, what can we learn in Australia and more broadly as an international community from Germany, Mexico and Indonesia's SDG leadership? So to focus on the Pacific Rim countries of Mexico and Indonesia, in the context of Mexico, we identified 7 key levers for enabling effective SDG policy planning and implementation in that country. To summarise, we found political support of the SDGs at the highest level of national government in the President's office to be the most important strategic lever for driving sustainable development planning. Indeed, Mexico had actually been a very significant player on the world stage pre-September 2015 in terms of working with the international community to formulate the SDG agenda and its framework. To maintain policy and planning momentum, Mexican key informants spoke to the need for government officials to receive regular SDG education and training, particularly on how the SDG agenda's 3 pillars, its economic, social and environmental pillars, interconnect. You know, how economic, environment and social policy cannot operate in departmental silos. So government officials need to be frequently exposed to the SDGs so the agenda doesn't slide off the radar of busy policymakers, and that they're talking to each other cross-departmentally. They need to see SDG implementation as part of their job, according to our Mexican informants. In turn, SDG champions in government need to be supported. Their voices need to be elevated in their own departments and across departments and agencies. In the Mexican context, we also found the government had worked very hard to develop a clear taxonomy on sustainable development, as well as sustainable financing that married with international understandings, so that both the public and private sectors were on the same page for sustainable development policy planning and operational purposes. This was also driven by the Mexican Ministry of Finance linking its budget allocations to the achievement of the 17 SDGs, which was a real innovation by the Mexican government and that Ministry of Finance, which I'm sure Laiza will speak to because she was involved in this. Key informants from Mexico also recommended government engage with and SDG champions within government strategically mobilise the financial sector. We found the financial sector were important champions to government to pursue the SDG and complementary economic, social and governance, ESG agendas, including sustainable financing policy initiatives. But again, our Mexican informants noted the importance of international pressure as another key lever and enabler to pursue the SDG agenda, and that this pressure needed to be maintained, whether that pressure came from multilateral agencies, international investors, overseas governments, and the international business community. In terms of the key levers for enabling effective SDG policy planning and implementation in Indonesia, again, like Mexico, our informants collectively spoke of the political will and support of the SDGs at the highest level of national government, at the presidential level and within the President's office. The work of Bappenas and of having a Bappenas equivalent was also highly praised. And Bappenas is Indonesia's Ministry for National Development Planning, and it's tasked with coordinating the country's SDG efforts to strategically guide and support SDG implementation across and among different levels of government, including at provincial and local levels. Overt or explicit use of reference to the SDGs was also really important in all government documents and meetings, according to our informants. So the SDGs really become the language of national development, but also that the SDGs are communicated in a way that is localised and appeals and makes sense to different audiences and stakeholders throughout the country. And informants were collectively in agreement that Indonesia's shift of its SDG commitments beyond policy to hard law through a 2017 presidential decree was very important. Now there was legal mandate, legal onus on government actors and other country actors to implement the SDGs across the country. Like Mexico, the role of the financial sector in driving forward SDG agenda implementation was commended by informants in the Indonesian context. And the need for government and the financial sector to work closely together to encourage complementary corporate sustainability practice and develop innovative SDG financing mechanisms. For instance, in 2018, SDG Indonesia 1 was launched, and this is a highly innovative platform managed by a 100% government-owned financial institution that aims to narrow the SDG financing gap for SDG-related infrastructure projects by mobilising funds from philanthropic donors and the private sector with infrastructure investment opportunities throughout Indonesia. So after we developed and generated our 3-country case study findings, we synthesised all 3 research component findings of the broader project on good practice SDG policy and planning to create an SDG Momentum Matrix. Just a brief example of that matrix is on your screen. And the matrix is a really practical tool that identifies and sets out the key indicators of best practice SDG governance policy planning as found by our study. The matrix can assist policymakers and other SDG stakeholders in any country of the world to engage in constructive policy discussion around why or why not or how a good practice SDG indicator is being adopted and into a particular country and to that country's development context. So for example, if I was a civil society actor in Malaysia, I could pick up the SDG Momentum Matrix and assess whether or if Malaysia is implementing any of the good practice indicators or a localised, contextualised version of the indicator, or maybe doing something even better than the indicator described to generate government accountability and transparency and momentum for genuine SDG achievement. So that's all from me. I'll hand back to Leanne so we can have a conversation with our Indonesian and Mexican SDG panellists about the report findings and learn more from our panellists about their experiences in SDG policy and planning in their respective countries. Stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for putting that extensive research into such a succinct framework. I really encourage those of you who work in this space or who are advocating for the SDGs to take a look at the research, which you can find on our webpage and through UQ as well. It's a very digestible and easy to read but comprehensive body of work. So thanks again, Claire, for leading that. And yes, I would love to turn now to draw out some of those best practice examples and understand from 2 fantastic experts, Laiza and Amanda, about what it's like at the coalface, trying to make progress on these complex but really important goals for our sustainable future. So, Laiza, I might start with you on the first question. Were you surprised that your country was identified through this research as demonstrating best practice in implementing the SDGs?
Well, first of all, thanks Leanne, Claire and Amanda. It's been a pleasure to share this event with you all and UNESCAP for hosting us. And to answer your question, honestly, yes. I think people imagine developed countries to be leading these type of national strategies and to be seen more forward thinking and developing countries to follow them. Well, in the case of developing countries, because in the case of developing countries, they have to prioritize into other areas, such as, I don't know, hunger control, violence, all these kind of things, etc. That maybe for developed countries, they don't have to deal with them as at the same magnitude as developing countries. And hence, it represents a bigger opportunity for developed countries to implement this type of strategies. That's why I was a little bit surprised, I have to say.
Yeah, that would make sense, wouldn't it? How about for you, Amanda? Were you surprised that Indonesia was represented as best practice?
It was really incredible, and I was definitely surprised, of course. and mostly amazed since such identification requires attention to detail of SDGs implementation, covering an archipelagic country like us with 17,000 islands. We have specific issues in different locations, and especially I wonder if we consider the main principle of SDGs, no one left behind, that needs to be assessed thoroughly. And what I would like to do, and what most Indonesians should do, is make this report viral so that everybody in the world knows not only our efforts, but the three countries' efforts, as well as Whitlam Institute's efforts and Claire's study, which she did tediously.
Thank you, Amanda. We'd love to get the research out there further. But just a quick follow-on question to that one. You know, it's, as Claire said earlier, it's not easy, is it? The SDGs are complex and multi-layered and interrelated, and they're about things that really matter to ordinary people's lives. They're about food and shelter and the environment and access to healthcare and education. So they're about very important substantive things. And to put this infrastructure in place takes a real dedication. So what Claire said about the need in both of your countries' examples, that it really was only possible to make the progress your countries did because of leadership and support at the highest levels of government. Can either of you say anything about suggestions for how you can generate that kind of leadership at the national level?
Laiza?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know if it's to generate, but I think I can talk from my experience within the government in Mexico. So actually the presidency created an agency to drive this program implementation and partner with the UNDP in Mexico. So I think once you have that power of that backup from a really top level, it actually makes a difference. So, for example, the UNDP and this agency spent, and it's not easy, and it requires time. So, for example, they spend about 3 months at least engaging with the right participants across sectors, society, academia, business, different national governments, agencies, in order to just define the right formulas to measure the SDGs and apply those into the Mexican context for them to use and to apply it into a web platform. So, and I can tell a little bit of like the experience of this platform and the role of the players and why it was so important. Well, in order to implement this strategy, it was basically to manage the relationship with this government agency, and it was developed with a partnership model that we actually invest a lot of time understanding each of the government agencies' capacities to identify which ones are the ones that could actually be the best fit to partner for implementation of, I mean, only for this platform I'm talking about. So the team was divided in different type of working group, let's say. I was involved in this SDGs platform. For example, we partnered with the National Census Agency to get accurate data, and the National Geographic Institute to get countries' digital maps that we could reuse them. So the idea was to create a partnership model among government agencies that could use their experience, their knowledge, and their resources to implement this platform, but also to benefit all the partners by creating connections, open future programs, and demonstrate the value that each agency had added into this program. I think it was key for the presidency to say, okay, we are leading these ones, partnering with the UNDP, but we are also showcasing that other agencies has the value to support this national agency. And this partnership model helped us to deliver on time and within budget the platform. And yeah, and I think something that it was all the time really backing up this program was that the Mexican presidency emphasizing the importance for each national agency and local governments to support this national program for the benefit of the whole country. So, and I honestly think that without this indication, perhaps we wouldn't have the support from other agencies and we couldn't finish the implementation on time and budget.
Thanks, Laiza. That's a great example of why the political leadership is important, and also a great description for us of one of the tools used by your national government, the platform to support implementation. Amanda, did you want to say anything about that importance of national leadership? And maybe could you share with us one of the tools you thought was most useful in Indonesia?
Yeah, sure. If we all know, we remember that the terms sustainable development have been around for decades. So most understand, or most stakeholders know the importance of sustainable development. And then it becomes, then the sustainable development goals was agreed, but through a long process. And the long process covers, again, multi-stakeholders, state actors, and non-state actors. So the no one left behind is not only on the implementation, but in the formulation of sustainable development goals, and also making the society understand what it is. Of course, the highest level of the government have been involved since the previous president, not only this one. So, and also the presidents are into their hands-on mode if you talk about sustainable development goals. Now, the important tool is, of course, a government commitment, the highest level, but not only commitment, but demonstrated through strong policies. That is the main tool that has been consistently implemented. Like Leanne mentioned, Indonesia is implementing presidential regulation concerning the implementation of achieving the sustainable development goals. And that regulation mandated the Ministry of National Development Planning of the Republic of Indonesia. But like in any policy making or policy formulation, although there is one government agency in charge of coordinating everything, but the content, the agreement has to involve multi-stakeholders, multi-agencies, including involving non-state actors, either through public consultancies or opinion. And because of the information is always available, also web-based. All the progress, you know, since the beginning up until now, it's all open for everybody to see. So again, government policy is important because that would come down to financing, and then also regulation down to the regional level, and again, involving state actors and non-state actors.
Thank you, Amanda. That kind of connects to the next question that I wanted to ask both of you. In the Australian experience at the moment, the private sector, universities, civil society are much further ahead in the conversation around the SDGs and why they're important, and doing work that links to the SDGs than the national government, I would say. So I wanted to ask both of you, how did your national governments work with stakeholders in business, civil society, academia, and subnational governments to lead a coalition for SDG implementation? Maybe Amanda, do you want to keep going, because you were starting to touch on that in your last response?
Right. It becomes one. I mean, we don't differentiate non-state actors and state actors in terms of attention of the will of the commitment to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. The main thing for the government is mainstreaming the SDGs into the national medium-term development plan, and other various development planning documents. By putting it into the development plan, of course, all stakeholders then will be involved, like the subnational government, the private sector, the academia. There are lots of things that could be done. And then, of course, the government is establishing SDGs National Action Plan, and it also involves multi-stakeholders. And our next SDGs National Action Plan will be launched this early 2021. And as I mentioned earlier, there are data, metadata indicator, and also SDGs achievement report. When we talk about the subnational, the National Development Planning Agency liaises with the Ministry of Home Affairs, as well as development partners like UN agencies, in preparation of the SDGs Regional Action Plans. Now, if you talk about development partners, they have different interests, right? For example, UNICEF will have different interests, will be focusing on children. And then there will be UNDP, there will be other UN agencies, UNESCO, each with their own focus and interest that will become coordinated because we have an annual SDGs annual conference involving 1,500 people from all walks of life, decision makers, academia, civil society, interest groups. So that's where they keep abreast of what's happening in terms of SDGs implementation.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Laiza, did you want to say anything about the government's leadership of coordination mechanisms for multi-stakeholder engagement in Mexico?
Yeah, well, back then, I think Mexican business were a little bit progressive. So I think they were pushing more towards seeing things happening. And I can relate that, pushing that into the government, and then the government being welcoming that part as well, and working with the UNDP back then. So it was a good synergy of how things were working together back then. Right now, I can't say how things have been progressing because I'm not working with the UNDP anymore, so I'm not really up to date. And I wouldn't like to provide a wrong picture. But also that makes me think, like, for example, now that I'm in Australia and applying that context, I would like to say that I don't think it's only a continuous education. I mean, it's only an education that policymakers and governments require. I think that continuous education or awareness, it's actually need to be spread among different sectors. For example, at my current role at the Development Partner Institute for Mining, we did a series of cross-sector interviews in Australia to understand the level of awareness on the SDGs related to mining in Australia, and how current global events, for example, the social shifts of 2020, such as COVID, the recognition of the need to address social injustice, climate change, and contribution of mining to economic and social progress have influenced and been influenced by awareness and achievement of the SDGs. I think there is a need of greater dialogue and action on this topic, and not only in the mining sector, but across the SDGs in Australia. That will be helping to everybody to bring that awareness at the same level. And for example, from that exercise that we did back into 2020, we did, for example, we are going to launch this report, and we're very excited to see emerging programs for climate change, health, ecosystem fund, and social value measurement. So if anyone wants to know more about it, just let me know. I'm happy to share more information about Australia. But I think in regards, how do we prioritize SDG education? I think these type of events, the ones that we are being part in right now, that can reach a lot of people and educate people, and organizations that supporting the SDGs opportunities to collaborate more effectively for impact, and to bring more awareness and wider these networks, I think that's going to be helping not only the government, but different sectors to help to bring that awareness.
Thank you. Both of you have mentioned the role of the United Nations and its agencies actively working in both of your countries as probably being a key partner, a stakeholder in SDG implementation in your countries. And it might be appealing for an Australian audience to say, oh, well, that's the difference between Mexico and Indonesia and Australia. We don't have UN agencies actively working on the ground here, so it's different. And I just wanted to mention, of course, that the other country that we drew on for the research was Germany, of course. And Germany also doesn't have UN agencies actively working on the ground there, but it does have a very strong relationship with the United Nations and proactively participates in both policy making and implementation. So I think it's interesting to think about the different role and the different relationships with multilateral organizations in terms of looking for global solutions to global problems, and how Australia might think about engaging more proactively in that space too. I have one more question for you both, if you don't mind, before we open up for some questions from our audience, our participants. So one of the key recommendations that particularly came out of the Mexican case study in our research was that policymakers and government officials need education, training and awareness on the SDG agenda. So I wanted to ask both of you, what does that education, training and awareness raising actually look like? What kind of content should be prioritized in that kind of SDG education and training if we were thinking about doing that in Australia, do you think? Liza, do you want to carry on?
Yeah, I think I just want to touch about that. From that interviews that we did last year in Australia about the awareness of the SDGs, I think and with all that happened last year has reinforced the need to continue to progress toward a more inclusive and sustainable practice, and accelerated the actions from industry, government and civil society. For example, we heard from participants that they were very enthusiastic to contribute to achieve sustainable outcomes linked to the SDGs. But people are seeking to find the right opportunities to collaborate with others, but there is uncertainty about how to start this process. I think there is this lack of awareness and education on how to implement the SDGs. And how do we prioritize that SDG education? I think, well, we have these type of events. And also in Australia, for example, we have the UN Association of Australia, which will be hosting this April the SDGs Partnership Forum, and the Global Compact Network Australia that is working a lot with the business sector. But we need all to contribute to sharing information, to strengthen the understanding of the SDGs areas as applicable for developed countries as for developing countries, from local to national level. And I think at the end of the day, the goal is to have a better world where government, business, people across all sectors can thrive. And I think something just to understand that the SDGs are not only for international awareness, it's just for, I think it starts with local and then national and then global. Yeah.
Yeah. Amanda?
Right. So when you talk about education, training and awareness, most assistance will usually come from development partners or UN agencies, among others. But remember when you said that Australia doesn't have UN agencies on the ground. Although we have UN agencies, but the programs are led by the government. Yep. They're not deciding. The development partners are not deciding what to do or what kind of audience it should be. It's usually through the government, and there are several requirements that they have to do in order to be involved with policy activities in Indonesia. And I also would like to thank Laiza for mentioning COVID, because there are emerging issues that slow the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, but our government commitment is always we have to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. That's why the Sustainable Development Goals Annual Conference that happened last year, at the end of last year, the theme was Build Forward Better, Rise Together from COVID-19 for Sustainable Development Goals. And these are part of education as well and awareness as well. So you don't just do, well, we have to train, for example, 5,000 government officials in terms of Sustainable Development Goals. No, they have to be involved in our day-to-day activities from all levels of society. In Indonesia, the government encouraged the formation, the establishment of SDG centers in universities throughout Indonesia. Right now, we have 20 SDG centers, and they have different activities and different focus in terms of Sustainable Development Goals. And then, of course, there are technical advice from the National Development Planning agencies to other ministries, as well as the subnational government. And another interesting thing, so it's not really a cut and dry education and training, but we do have SDGs Indonesia campus ambassadors, for example. Isn't that nice? So there are SDGs campus ambassadors in several universities in Indonesia. There are also youth organizations working on this, and some activities were assisted by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, led by Professor Jeffrey Stock from Columbia University. And then, of course, there are SDG movers. They come from some celebrities, and I was invited also to be SDG mover, maybe for other areas. So there are many, many activities, interesting activities to involve art, technology, and many, many things. Now, why technology is important? Because of this slowing down because of COVID, then the government and the National Academy of Sciences in Indonesia decided that we have to focus on innovation in many areas so that we can still achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. You have to keep thinking and come with creative, out-of-the-box ideas.
Yeah. You know, Amanda, to hear you talking about your conference last year and the focus on building back better from COVID, it really rings true to an Australian audience, I think. Here, just before COVID, we had the terrible, terrible bushfires. We've had drought. We're now we're having floods, and the socio-economic and environmental impacts are coming together like a perfect storm, affecting people's lives in very severe ways every day. And it's just really striking to us through this research, I think, that a government facing this array of problems wouldn't grab on to the SDGs as a blueprint, as a roadmap for how to build back better in a more sustainable way. So it's really wonderful to hear from both of you and to learn from you about what works and what's hard and what doesn't. And I hope that all of our participants are finding this as interesting as I am. We might take some questions now, if you don't mind. I have a first one here, and it's a question for you, Claire. I have an anonymous attendee who's asking, what would you say are the one or two most significant differences that stand out between Indonesia and Mexico in implementation? And what insights did you glean from those differences that might help other countries, I suppose, in their choices? Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And thank you to the participant who raised it. A few things struck me about the Mexican and Indonesian case studies, and I'll also allude to the German one as well, is that in the Mexican context, the driver for SDG policy making and planning was budgets and you know, the financial side, the role of the Ministry of Health, and the role of the Ministry of Health in terms of leading that and partnering across government to really you know, ask and call other government policymakers to account on what is it that you're doing that has a budget line against the SDGs. But what I found interesting in the Indonesian context was the role of law in terms of driving forward SDG policy making. So Indonesia, I just have to applaud your country, Amanda. I'm just constantly blown away. I was constantly blown away by the steps Indonesia had taken to implement the SDGs in policy planning and governance frameworks. But really what shifted the dial with Indonesia was the presidential decree. So the SDG agenda shifted from policy to hard law. So we had that legal mandate, that legal onus in Indonesia. So that's what also created impetus, legal impetus on policymakers to really work hard in terms of SDG implementation. I found that bi-directional relationship between policy making, planning in the development space and budgets and law very, very interesting. I thought what's also interesting is that Indonesia and Mexico took a very integrated approach in terms of its planning around the 3 pillars. So there was equal weight to the economic pillar, the social pillar and the environmental pillar. Although there was also discussion raised by informants from Mexico that there was, it was likely that under the new president, the focus might be a little bit less on environment, but more so on the social pillar. But certainly across all 3 countries, the need for a clear taxonomy in terms of sustainable financing was very much emphasised by informants. So emphasis on the role of the economic in creating momentum for the environment and social. In terms of the German case study, what I found very interesting was a key finding that, or recommendation that policymakers, German informants recommended that policymakers should begin by focusing on the environmental pillar. They should begin by focusing on the big environmental or climate change related issues facing the country, and be mindful of how these big issues and addressing these big issues overlap with cost-cutting social and economic policy questions. And this focus on the environmental will obviously require regular cross-cutting, multi-departmental, multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral meetings. Again, what I also particularly liked that came up out of the German case study was this sense that, if you want to enable SDG policy and planning, yes, again, political will at the highest level is also absolutely crucial. That came across all 3 case studies. But you also have to work hard at fostering an appreciation amongst government leaders that the sustainable development policy and planning process is complicated and it's lengthy, but to no less invest in that process and to be pragmatic. So part of that pragmatism was to suggest start with the environment, start with your environmental policies and link that to the SDG agenda, and then from there link in all your economic and your social pillars. Again, regular policy meetings foster government accountability and allow for robust, honest discussion among key policy actors to identify SDG commonalities and trade-offs, both within government and without government. So the need for constant, I think in the Indonesian context, our informants called it socialization, constant discussion. But with the German informants, it was really about, having really robust, rigorous debate and getting honest.
Some good questions coming in for all of you. Maybe Amanda, quite a practical one for you from Wendy Flannery, who asks, the 20 centres you mentioned at universities across Indonesia, Wendy's asking whether they have paid staff or are they volunteers, I suppose, or students?
They are paid staff because they work for the universities, and then they're assigned into the SDG centers.
Thank you. Anne Stevens has put in a couple of questions. I might go to perhaps her more controversial one. Anne says, Robin Naidu and Brendan Fisher wrote in Nature in July 2020 that the success of the SDGs depends on two big assumptions, the first being sustained economic growth and the second being globalisation. COVID-19 has torn these to shreds. She says they call for a substantive reset and reduction of the number of goals we agree to, or a major redirection of military spending across the globe if we're going to achieve the 2030 agenda. Given military budgets, and here's the question, given military budgets are unlikely to be sacrificed by countries, should we reduce the number of goals in order to save some of the agenda? Who wants to take that one?
I can start. I think we can look to, for example, in Indonesia, government's really working hard to develop innovative financing platforms and mechanism between the private and public sector. So I think there is, finance is an issue, but I think that's why we also need to really partner with the business and private sector and really link this to their ESG commitments and responsibilities.
Yeah, the way I see it, if I may, the goals are interrelated. They don't stand alone. Some of them are also in groups. So I would like all the goals to stay, and each goal might help each other. But we do also have achievement reports, so we do know what's lacking and what needs to be improved. And that also answers the question from Anne Stevens about how are we doing on the evaluation of the SDGs.
Mm.
Yeah, I just want to add, similar to Amanda's point of view, I think all the SDGs needs to stay. I think it's how we perceive them. For example, good health and well-being. In order to achieve SDG 3, we need to ensure that there is no poverty, SDG 1, SDG 2, zero hunger. So in order to, they are all interrelated. And I think for me, the most important one is the SDG 17 partnership for the goals, that if different sectors collaborate, all these SDGs can be achieved. But I think it's more towards priority of which SDGs we need to tackle first, and in order to achieve the other ones.
Yep, thanks, Liza. In relation to Anne's question about, Anne Stevens also asks, she says the emphasis in this discussion is rightly on implementation, and the comment was made that there needs to be more education about how to implement the SDGs, but she asks, what about evaluation of the SDGs? How well are we doing in that regard? In relation to Australia, and Claire can say more on this, Australia did submit its first voluntary review under the SDGs. I think for those of us who work with the SDGs closely, or who know what kind of reporting was in that voluntary review, we're not doing a very serious job. We're not collecting data the way some of these other countries are, specifically designed to contribute to that reporting. So we could certainly be doing more. And one of the projects that we're working on at the Whitlam Institute is a pilot project for where we live in Western Sydney, to try and understand how much work is going on in our community, from academia to NGOs to local government, that is reportable and linkable to the SDGs, but is not being perceived of as being relevant to the SDGs and is not being collected in terms of data. So that's just a pilot project that we if it goes well, we'd like to ramp up so that we can capture more, so that we can evaluate better how Australia is performing. We're almost at time. Claire, did you want to say anything in terms of final remarks?
Yeah, in terms of evaluation, I'd just like to leave with, yes, evaluation is critical, but there's two things critical to evaluation. Evaluation and monitoring of the SDG implementation is to be done well by a country. And that is your goals and targets and your indicators all need to be locally contextualized. How we would, you know, the priorities for example, SDG 5, gender equality in this country, and the targets and the indicators would markedly differ to Indonesia, for example. So that's what's really very important. And secondly, we also need to have strong information and data management systems that can capture data. And I'm involved in civil vital statistics system strengthening, which I won't go into in detail, but they're the systems that you produce your birth and your death data. And these systems are very important in terms of the data and the statistics they generate for SDG management. But also when we're monitoring and evaluating, it's also not about the numbers. It's not just about the numbers. We have to also think about ways to ensure that voices and the qualitative is incorporated into monitoring and evaluation. Yeah, that's mine.
Yeah. Thank you, Claire. I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Liza. Thank you, Amanda. And thank you so much again, Claire, for all of your hard work on this research. This has been a fascinating discussion, and there are a lot of really great questions in the Q&A that we could talk a lot longer about. But I might just mention as we finish, you know, Andrew Jewell has asked, you know, how can we influence governments to commit further to the SDGs? And I just wanted to say, you know, the United Nations Association of Australia discussion around this next month, and if you go to their website you can get some details about who'll be speaking and on what, but that's going to be a real opportunity for people to gather virtually, or, you know, I think it's fully virtual now, to get together and think about next steps so that we can achieve exactly what you're suggesting. So once again, thank you to our panelists, and thank you to all of you who took the time to join us at this side event, and all the best to those of you who are involved in the forum itself. I hope it goes really well. Thank you for your time, and goodbye.